until it was resolved in the National Football League. And we're talking about the saga of Antonio Brown and the Pittsburgh Steelers and his future in the National Football League. Well, Antonio Brown, this is just a little after 12:30 in the afternoon, East Coast time, on his Twitter feed, says, "Thank you, Steeler Nation, for a big 9 years. It's time to move on and forward." So he's saying his goodbyes to the franchise, to the organization, the only one that he has known in his time in the entire National Football League. And look, it's really no surprise, right? I mean, everybody from the Pittsburgh Steelers organization, whether it be Kevin Colbert, the general manager, Mr. Rooney, the owner, everybody on down, you kind of had the idea that Antonio Brown had already played his last game as a Steeler when he walked out on the team going into week number 17 of the regular season last year. His team still with a pulse to make the playoffs, and then you had the disagreement and whatnot in practice, and they just said, you know what, don't even bother showing up. He showed up, he left at halftime of the Week 17 game. You knew that Antonio Brown pretty much made his bed when it came to the Pittsburgh Steelers moving forward, and he wasn't going to be part of the solution any further. But now you have yourself a very, very capable player. A guy who is one of the best, if not the best, wide receivers in all the National Football League. And let's be honest, a difference maker. A difference maker. He can help your team. He is as dynamic a playmaker in a league full of them that you have right now playing in the National Football League. Our own Adam Schefter tweeted out moments ago. Just a little further more context on this story. That Antonio Brown has not been traded, nor has he been released. But Brown wants a trade, and he officially has requested that from the Steelers. He's gone. Okay, he's not going to be a Pittsburgh Steeler any longer. And if you're talking about salary cap ramifications and what it means for the football team, if the Steelers go ahead and make the trade, he's got a $21.12 million prorated signing bonus that the Steelers are going to be hit for with their salary cap if this goes through. They're only essentially saving about $1 million if he's no longer on the team. Now, what do you get if you trade for Antonio Brown? What's the price tag going to be if you bring in Antonio Brown onto your team? You got to figure you're going to part with at least a first-round pick. That's a starting point. That's just going to begin the conversations and then some. But is it really worthwhile? You know, you can ask yourself the question, and I think it's a legitimate one. In this day and age where, yes, I know that it's a passing league. Yes, I know that offense is generally speaking going to win out more often than not, even though we saw a Super Bowl that was the lowest scoring in the history of the game. But more often than not, you need to score points, and the NFL has become an explosive entity. So is it really worthwhile to give up the farm to bring Antonio Brown onto your football team? I mean, it's a legitimate question. Does he make you better? Absolutely. But is it really worth giving up whatever the asking price is going to be in a trade, and then also what you're ultimately going to be hit with on your salary cap? Still under contract for a few more years. Still going to have to pay that. And I'm sure that in some way, shape, or form, he might want the contract dealt with. Maybe he's not even happy with what he's getting paid with right now, even though he just signed a contract a couple of years ago. You know how these guys are. It seems like on any given day they want to change it up. Some guy's making more than me. This guy just got an extension. I need to be taken care of now. Does it really benefit you to have a full-fledged, top-flight wide receiver on your team? Is that conducive to winning yourself a championship? I mean, look at the New England Patriots. Okay, they're the Super Bowl champions. I know there's been a lot of talk about Julian Edelman, who was the game MVP, and oh my goodness, we need to put him in the Hall of Fame now just because he's got a Super Bowl MVP. Pump the brakes on that. But what Super Bowl have the New England Patriots won out of the 6 where they had themselves a dynamite, bona fide, surefire, stud wide receiver? Really haven't. Really haven't. You know, when you have the good quarterback like Tom Brady, you're able to make guys like Edelman, like Amendola, who I know wasn't there this year, but the Chris Hogans of the world, and on and on and on. You can make those guys successful if you have a good quarterback. Okay, all those playmakers that the Los Angeles Rams had on their team, how did they function in the big game? How did that work out for them necessarily? You know, you look at a guy, we have this conversation a lot in New York when it comes to the New York Giants and Odell Beckham. You know, Odell Beckham is a dynamic playmaker. This is a guy who clearly is one of the more talented players at his position in the NFL. And he's always the center of attention, it seems like. But what if the New York Giants won with Odell Beckham on their roster? I'll tell you what, not a heck of a lot. So it begs the question, is it really worthwhile to bring Antonio Brown onto your football team? You know, should I give up precious draft capital if I have it just to bring this guy on? Well, what if I don't have a stable quarterback situation, number one? What if my offensive line is in tatters? What if I have holes all throughout the rest of my football team where, okay, if I bring on Antonio Brown, that makes me better in one sense, but I still have several other holes on my team that's going to prohibit me from winning a championship. It takes more than just one guy. We're not talking about a quarterback here. The quarterback is the true difference maker more often than not. And an Antonio Brown, an Odell Beckham, a Julio Jones, whatever top wide receiver you want to name in this sport, they're only going to be as good as the guy giving them the football. That's it. And you know what? A lot of Antonio Brown's success over the years, that has to be attributed to one Ben Roethlisberger. I think he deserves some of that credit. And clearly now, without having Antonio Brown, it's going to put more on Big Ben's shoulders because he might be losing Le'Veon Bell as well. And he didn't even have him all of last year. You know, that's another whole conversation that I think that we can delve into here. What about the Pittsburgh Steelers? Where do they go from here? Okay, they were able to function and have themselves, I guess you could say, a decent season last year without Le'Veon Bell. You know, James Conner had a heck of a year filling the void, but they still missed out on the postseason. And then they had the Antonio Brown thing blow up in their face at the end when it mattered most, and now he wants to move on from the franchise. Right, they have some other guys there at the position. You know, Juju Smith-Schuster really came into his own and became one of the top playmakers, really, I think, in all the AFC. You think you're going to get yourself some nice capital in return in whatever trade it might net you, and then you're going to free up possibly, some open spaces there on your field for other guys to come in and make a contribution. The one thing about a team like the Pittsburgh Steelers, the one thing you say about organizations like that is that they know what they're doing more often than not. They know how to build a winner. Okay, they get these guys, whether it be in the draft, even in the mid to later rounds, and they develop them into playmakers. You know, when Antonio Brown was drafted, he wasn't somebody that we could term necessarily a surefire can't-miss prospect. Could we? Same thing goes for Le'Veon Bell. They took a flyer on a James Conner. Juju Smith-Schuster, they've developed him into a very quality player. So it's more about getting football players, bringing them into that program, and developing them from there on out. That's the key. And the successful organization, starting right at the top with the New England Patriots, they're able to do that. How much roster turnover do the New England Patriots have on a year-in, year-out basis? A heck of a lot, it seems. But they've got the quarterback. They've got the head coach, they've got the system in place, and it doesn't matter if they lose coordinators, it doesn't matter if they lose Pro Bowlers, they just fill the void next man up, the next man up mentality, which you hear spoken a lot about in the National Football League. A lot of teams preach that. Because nowadays with the salary cap, you can't keep all of your guys. You have to make tough decisions. You have to say goodbye to guys that have been good for you for a very long time. But if you can't pay everybody, that's why the draft is so important. And that's why bringing in young talent, young controllable talent, that's the key to building a winner long term. Yes, you need the quarterback. Yes, it'd be great to get yourself an impact pass rusher, a couple of playmakers here and there. But really, in my opinion, the quarterback is the one position in the National Football League and professional football nowadays that you can ill afford to live without if you want to be a consistent winner. So Antonio Brown is going to be out there now for all takers. Those that have the salary cap space, those that have a package that's going to be accommodating enough for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Question you got to ask yourself, if you are one of those teams, if you fit into that category, is that somebody that you want to bring in? Is that somebody that you want to bring onto your football team? Yeah, he's a heck of a player. Absolutely, he's a heck of a player. Difference maker. But he also brings a heck of a lot of other components as well. He's got some baggage. I mean, earlier this morning, before we even saw the tweet about him wanting to be traded, failed to show up for a court appearance to where he had to go and answer to driving 100 miles an hour. There was a domestic report that came out just the other day involving Antonio Brown. These are things now that you may have to get into bed with if you bring him onto your team. Because you know what? If you make the commitment, If you give up, let's say, several draft picks, some may even be first rounders, you bring the guy onto your football team, you take that contract on, you bring him into your program, and let's just say something goes wrong. You know, he gets into trouble or something happens where he's going to be suspended and he's not going to be on the field. If you're that team that gave up all that stuff, you don't get it back. Right? I mean, you don't have a receipt where you can take it back and say, okay, this ain't working out. I want my draft picks back. It doesn't go like that. You know, the Oakland A's, they wasted a first-round pick, a top 10 pick in the MLB draft last summer for Kyler Murray. Now he decides he wants to go play football. The A's don't get that pick back, unfortunately. Major League Baseball doesn't mail them a compensatory pick and say, all right, guys, you got an extra first-rounder in the upcoming draft in June for next year. Doesn't work that way. So that's something you have to think long and hard about. I'm not sitting here and disputing the fact that he's a talented player. He's a great player. Might be the best wide receiver in the National Football League. But I'll ask you the question again. The Pittsburgh Steelers, who had a heck of a lot of talent on that team over the last decade, since Antonio Brown has been there, a lot of talent on that football team. What did they win with him on the roster? What did they win? How many Lombardi trophies were delivered because of Antonio Brown? Tell me that. Odell Beckham again with the Giants. How many Super Bowl trophies were he responsible for that the Giants have? They've got 4 of them in their trophy case there in East Rutherford, New Jersey. None of them are because of Odell Beckham. He's got 1 playoff game. 1. You know, Julio Jones went to a Super Bowl. They blew a 28-3 lead. Didn't win it. So buyer beware is all I'm saying. I know the salary cap keeps going up. I know that there's more money to spend when you're talking about the National Football League. But if you really want to give all of it to a wide receiver, I think you got to think long and hard about this one. Especially a guy like Antonio Brown now who's got some baggage. You have to think long and hard about that. You know, Mike Tomlin had no problem. Think about that. And Mike Tomlin knows him as good as anybody. He's coached him his whole career, right? But Mike Tomlin had no problem. And this is a bottom line business, remember, where everybody does everything humanly possible to try to win. Because winning means you keep your job, you keep getting your contract extensions. I mean, we just saw this whole thing yesterday in the uproar over Kareem Hunt signing with the Cleveland Browns. And how dare they do that, right? But you sign him because he's a damn good football player. And he's going to help us win football games. So Mike Tomlin, going into Week 17, when they had an opportunity, or they needed to at least win to keep their season afloat, and then some, he had no issue whatsoever telling Antonio Brown, arguably his best player on offense, told him, you know what? Don't even bother suiting up. Don't even bother suiting up. So if the Steelers could say that, you think I'm going to be lining up to give them maybe 2 first-round picks and then some for this guy? When we know that he was a divisive presence in the locker room? That's a tough ask, don't you think? That is a very difficult sell if you ask me. But somebody's going to roll the dice on him. And I still think that he's got a lot of good football left. Remember, this day and age in the NFL, you have a longer shelf life than maybe wide receivers back in the day did. If you take care of your body the right way, if you stay relatively injury-free, you're going to be able to be productive for a few more years. And I think that he will be. But it is going to be it's not a slam dunk. And normally when you have a player of his talent and that ability, it should be a slam dunk. But that's not the case when you're talking about Antonio Brown. Remember, want to hear from you at 888-SAY-ESPN, 888-729-3776. Dan Graca on the Stephen A. Smith Show here on ESPN Radio and ESPN News. And there's a lot of stuff swirling around with the National Football League, too. I mentioned Kyler Murray, and we're going to get into him as well because I think that's a fascinating situation when you talk about what could potentially lie ahead for him in the NFL draft. We know we got the Combine coming up next week from Indianapolis. Fantastic, right? You could start to sniff already next season with the Combine. And I know it's not for everybody. It's a bunch of guys in T-shirts and shorts running around and, high jump, long jump, 40-yard dash, that type of thing. I get it. And the true determination of a player isn't going to be what they do in T-shirt and shorts. Wait till they put the helmet on. Wait till they put the pads on before we know if they can cut it or not on the next level. But the thing I like about the Combine is that it's a few weeks before the start of the new calendar year in the NFL. Then you're going to have free agency. Then you're going to have player movement. You could already start to begin the process of already looking ahead to next year. And now Kyler Murray is going to be a name that when you're starting to forecast the draft and where these quarterbacks could potentially go, now he factors into the equation in a big way. We know what Cliff Kingsbury, the new coach of the Arizona Cardinals, the comments he made way back when about, boy, if I was running the show and I had my druthers, Kyler Murray would be the number one pick in the draft. I'd move heaven and earth to make sure he would be the guy. Well, now Cliff Kingsbury is sitting there as the coach of the Arizona Cardinals, and he has the number one pick in the draft, and Kyler Murray is going to be part of this draft. But what do you do if you're Cliff Kingsbury and the Arizona Cardinals? Because you just drafted a quarterback in the first round last year by the name of Josh Rosen, and he didn't exactly wow in his first year, but you know what? It's not all his fault. The Cardinals were a bad football team last year. That's why they have the number one pick right now, and Cliff Kingsbury didn't draft him. It was the previous regime, even though Steve Keim, general manager, was still there. He's the one who turned in the card ultimately. So the organization probably still has some high hopes for Josh Rosen. But now you have a new man in charge, and Kingsbury was hired more so than anything for his offensive acumen, right? He has that Big 12-type background, which is exactly where Kyler Murray came from. And Kyler Murray won a Heisman Trophy playing quarterback for the Oklahoma Sooners. And I don't think it's a secret to say that if you've watched the NFL, save for maybe Super Bowl 53, I mean, the NFL is almost morphing into the Big 12, right? More often than not, defense isn't really a premium, at least not what it used to be, and you have these teams going up and down the field in the passing game. So a guy like Kyler Murray, who, maybe with socks on is a shade over 5'9", at least according to the experts, maybe a quarterback of his stature back in the day wouldn't have the opportunity to be successful. There would probably be a lot of teams in the NFL who would be reluctant to make that big of an investment on a guy who's on the diminutive side. But we've seen others have success now. Russell Wilson isn't exactly 6'5". He's been successful. He's one of the top quarterbacks in the NFL. Drew Brees is probably just a shade over 6 feet, and he's forged a Hall of Fame career. Baker Mayfield, right? Baker Mayfield. Do you remember what the talk was about Baker Mayfield last year leading up to the draft? Throughout the entire process, people were saying if Baker Mayfield were only a few inches taller, he'd be the number one pick in the draft. But I don't know if I can make that type of commitment to a guy who's, about 6'1", generously? Until Baker Mayfield became the first pick in the draft, that is. So while everybody is casting doubts upon Kyler Murray now that he's not big enough and he's not going to be successful enough because he's only 5'9", well, it's only February. We still have over 2 months until the NFL draft actually commences. And between now and then, a lot could happen. You have the Combine. You have individual meetings. Remember, it wasn't until, I'm trying to think back, maybe a few weeks before the draft last year, where all of a sudden you started to hear these rumblings about Baker Mayfield. And that maybe, just maybe, he might end up being the guy now shooting up the draft board. And Cleveland was going to take him with the first overall pick in the draft until they did. So the same thing might happen here with Kyler Murray. Now, do I think that he'll be the number one pick right now? Okay, in the middle of February? I'll probably say no. Do I think he's a first-round pick? Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do, because I know the world that we're living in right now in the NFL. And you need a quarterback. You need a franchise difference maker. And I think with some of the concepts and with some of the offenses that you certainly have seen more ingrained in this league over the last several years, guys like Kyler Murray at least now have a foundation to be successful. I don't know if he's a day one starter walking right in, but he's going to have an opportunity to see the field, I think, in the next couple of years. And that really, to me, is what probably swayed him more than anything else. And look, I can't get inside his head. I don't know if this is true or not. But when he was going back and forth about, do I play baseball, do I play football, all anybody wants to do is an athlete. I don't care if you're a pro. I don't care if you're in high school. I don't care if you're in Little League, right? Because not all of us ended up being professional athletes. All you want to do is play. All you want to do is have an opportunity to prove yourself. And I think if you weigh the two, if you're Kyler Murray, you get a better opportunity to get on the football field faster in the NFL than he would if he was playing baseball. There were no guarantees that he would have been able to shoot through the minor league system for the Oakland A's. What if he was struggling hitting the baseball? What if he was having a hard time hitting breaking stuff and chasing pitches outside the plate? That's a realistic possibility. In between, he'd be riding buses and having to go through the low levels of the minor leagues. Just because you're a first-round pick, if you're not performing, you don't get the call-up. It's as simple as that. On the NFL, on the other hand, if you're a first-round pick as a quarterback, and even if you don't start from day one, more often than not, you are going to get your opportunity in some way, shape, or form to see what you can do in real game situations. Not talking about preseason. Remember last year, Lamar Jackson was the last pick of the first round, right? He didn't start day one. He had a former Super Bowl MVP ahead of him with the Baltimore Ravens. But eventually, the Ravens' offense became stagnant. They went to the bullpen. They tapped Lamar Jackson on the shoulder, middle of the season, and he took off from there. And yeah, the financials are a big part of this whole thing, too. I mean, think about it. Even if you are the last pick in the first round in 2019 in the NFL draft, all right, let's just say Kyler Murray is, even though I don't think that's going to be the case. But even if you're the last pick in the round, you're still going to be taking home probably in the neighborhood of $10 million in guaranteed money. $10 million. That's a nice chunk of change. You're not getting $10 million right when you sign if you're a Major League Baseball player. You saw what the contract he got right off the bat for the Oakland A's was. And who's to say he was going to be able to make it to the major leagues, to where he would be able to have a successful career and then possibly in turn earn upwards of that $10 million. I think it's a no-brainer. Yes, there's inherent injury risk, short-term, long-term, I get it. Football's a more violent, more of a contact sport than, let's say, baseball is. But he's giving giving himself the best chance to be successful. And we're going to spend a lot of time over the next 2 months debating whether or not he's going to be a good pro quarterback and whether or not you should invest a high draft pick in him. Are we talking about a guy who's top 5 material? And if you're a team like the New York Jets now, sitting there with the 3rd overall pick in the draft, and you do not need a quarterback because you picked Sam Darnold last year, that just makes your situation a little bit more tempting to all the other teams behind you. Because now if you're Mike McCagnon, the GM, maybe the phone's going to be ringing a little bit more if a team falls in love with Kyler Murray. 888-SAY-ESPN is the telephone number, 888-729-3776. That is Straight Talk Wireless, nationwide coverage on America's largest and most dependable 4G LTE networks. When you're hiring, you don't want to waste time sorting through dozens of irrelevant resumes. You want an efficient way to a short list of qualified candidates. That's why you need Indeed.com. Post a job in minutes, set up screener questions based on your job requirements, then zero in on qualified candidates using an intuitive online dashboard. Discover why 3 million businesses use Indeed for hiring. Post a job today at Indeed.com/hire.